Hello, Professor Roy. It's Robert here. I'm going to lay out in a quick lecture and outline what I've been doing for the past quarter, why I've been doing it, and where I've come to and what I need to do next. What needs to be done next. Going to start with a basic explanation of why I'm doing what I'm doing. In anthropology, we have linguistics, and linguistics has a set of tools and a whole perspective and methodology for studying the lineage of languages. Not only lineage, but also the flow and changes of languages and the rules upon which they change, like the consonantal shift in German. We don't have anything for that we can apply to classical movement, classical dance, classical martial arts, other forms of ritualized, medically taught, individual movement situations. That is why I have started the studies that I have started. And because it's essentially kinesiology, I've started with dance theory. The first thing I've started with is Laban movement analysis, and therefore also Barton fundamentals, and also Alan Lomax and choreometrics. Although I haven't read any of his books, I have actually had a hard time finding things that he's written for less than $200. So what I'm going to do is I'm first going to go over the basic aspects of those methodologies that I've taken with me. And then I would like to go over some of the books that I read for class. I guess a more appropriate way of saying is some of the research that I've done in actual reading form, which are in two sections: kinesiological works and evidences of poor pedigree and poor academic quality for classical martial arts. And then I want to go back to what has been going on and what I've found, and lay out, after that, what has to happen next. So the first thing is Laban movement analysis and Rudolf von Laban give any practitioner of any classical movement, or any movement study or discipline, a sense of what the world is like to interact with in a more fundamental and esoteric way. For instance, the whole idea of the skeleton being a series of crystalline structures which are made by the countertensions of muscles pulling in different sort of ways. Fascinating. And most of the LMA that I've read, I actually read through Bartneff, because my principal study book was Bartneff's Body Movement, which is about her fundamentals, which is specifically about the body, her explanation of LMA, and then her expounding on it. But in general, the both of them, but particularly Bartneff, very helpful in explaining what the world is like and how the world works in terms of a conscientious body. The next person who was really effective was Alan Lomax, who was a musicologist along with his father and then on his own, but then eventually studied classical dances and came up with the concept which he worked on with Bartneff, called choreometrics. And choreometrics is very fundamentally important to the entire course of the study and the development of this practice and these methodologies that I'm about to talk about. And this is why, because the fundamental issue in choreometrics is that all movement is fundamentally contextual and also fundamentally different from time to time and place to place. So even the same movement, say, is very different here or here. Now, it doesn't seem so, but then when you take more dramatic examples, such as a man disrobing excited in his bedroom with his consort, very different contextually than a man disrobing excited in the schoolyard. Consequently, it leads us to a very fundamental primary issue and primary question. If all movement is contextual, and if the context forces upon it difference in the actual manifestation and meaning of the movement, does that force then engender change of the actual movement? Does the movement change because the context changes, like water on rock? Very basic underlying principle of question, which arises a lot of the work that in terms of developing the conjecture for what the tools might be and how we might prove them over the course of the quarter. So just to go over really quickly the books that I read, I want to start out with two examples of books which are books on classical martial arts and why they're not that effective. The first one I'm going to do is the Shaolin 10 Animal Form. And this man here is Shifu Guantaking, or Xing. He's very, very famous for having starred in movies over a period of nearly 60 years, I think maybe more than 60 years, in Hong Kong cinema, and having played Wong Fei Hong, who is a Chinese martial arts hero from the 19th century, over 120 times. It's a lot of times to play the same character in movies. And as Wong Fei Hong, later in his career, probably around the time that he made this, maybe even a little later, he was in the greatest duel ever put on cinema ever, which is a calligraphy battle. Two men fighting with brushes, whilst also doing a piece of calligraphy. Absolutely amazing. Now, the other issue is that while he is a very famous martial artist, he's also a very famous actor. And as you can see, with his faces and the other guy's face, he's kind of kidding around. The Shaolin 10 Animal Form is the basics, especially for Southern Shaolin, and Wong Fei Hong studied Southern Shaolin. But after studying LMA and Barton Fundamentals, you can easily read the body language. You can tell that he doesn't mean it. I mean, in most of these, he looks like a grandfather scaring his children, his grandchildren. Let me give you an example. I mean, so this is what passes for classical teaching in the format of books and classical recording of fundamentals in books. You know, the issue here is that it would actually be better and easier to read if he just wrote out what the movements were. Because even when he's doing the movements, and you know, I brought up the issue of the film because during that duel, he's in horse stance, which is basically sitting down but without anything under you. And they kick a chair out from under him, and then they have someone stand on his knees as an 80-year-old man. It's pretty impressive. So there's evidence that he still is in proper martial conditioning. So the fact that there's no actual martial tension in any of his musculature in these movements is symptomatic of the whole issue. And here's a book on the Shaolin Temple, which is, as a brief answer, roughly analogous to both Oxford and like the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers, because it was a clerical monastic institution, much like early medieval European universities, and it was also a martial monastic order, much like other medieval organizations. And it was a particularly successful martial temple. There were a lot of them, much like the different orders of holy knights. And the reasons for it were mostly political. Just as a brief issue, what happened was at the beginning of the Sung, at the end of the Tang, they were already in fighting form because of the yogic practices that they did. And they bet on the right horse, essentially. During the upheaval and development of the Sung dynasty, there was a Sung prince who was being hunted by Tang soldiers and a general, and they found him. The monks found him and took him in and protected him. And so, even though the Sung was a very particularly secular dynasty in middle and late classical China, they were well protected, unlike other temples, because of that during that secular period. And in fact, it was an issue with the Sung nobility and aristocracy to be benefactors for the Shaolin Temple. So, So the issue is, this book is, first of all, here are the illustrations in this book. Yeah, those are grayscaled, photoshopped pictures of roughly hewn Caucasoid men. And, you know, that's fine. I happen to be a Caucasoid man who studies classical Chinese martial arts. But I can tell you, if and when I publish a book on the Shaolin Temple, there will not be pictures of me in it dressed as a monk. Unless, of course, at that point I am a monk, which chances are pretty good that I won't be at the time. So, there's a section called Robert's Rules of Combat. I mean, this is just atrocious. And books like these are the reason that I started the project. Because save for an Israeli academic by the name of Meyer and his book on the Shaolin Temple, there really aren't any decent academic books. And I've looked for a considerable period of time, over a considerable period of years. Now, that's not necessarily true in China, and Japan, and Korea, Taiwan, particularly in Korea, Taiwan, and Japan, because most of the pedigree that we have for classical martial arts, particularly in the Shaolin Temple, suffers from a great schism thanks to the Cultural Revolution in 1966. And in fact, most of the martial heritage that we have, Chinese martial heritage that we have in the United States, comes from refugees who fled either directly then or from Indonesia, because many people fled Indonesia. So that's kind of where a lot of the problem lies, because we don't have in the West a lot of accurate and verifiable academic pedigree. And furthermore, no one really has any kind of historical. There is no methodology for doing forensic research in this field. So, getting to the books that I have that are useful, I have two separate books. One on Spartan Fundamentals, which is fairly decent. And this is Peggy Hackney. And this is New Love and Dolby, which is Laban for All. And this book I am not crazy about. It's not the easiest thing to read. It's a little dry. The size of the book and the typeface make it a little small for what it needs to be. And as a consequence, although I have these books, I haven't looked at them or read them nearly as extensively as I have this book. This book, which is actually written by Manan Bartniff, well, with Dory Lewis, so, you know. But this is Bartniff's book, Body Movement. And in this, the illustrations are really good. And a lot of them are simply pictures of people doing things with descriptions using, Laban and Bartniff movement descriptors. For instance, three-dimensional shaping and hand form provide synchronous link between the two people. Flow, light, sustained effort. Adult shaping and effort are synchronized. So this book was really the source of my academic study for this quarter, and I really like Bartniff, and I would like to do more with Bartniff. I would like to find more on Lomax in an affordable and corporeal manner, because I found some things online, PDFs, small articles, but not actual books, and most of the stuff that Lomax has published and available are on musicology, which is a fascinating subject. But I'm not going to go into a tangent about that today. His issues with colorimetrics are actually directly applicable, and I really, really, really want to read more about that. I think there's a lot in there. But Bartniff and Bartniff fundamentals make not only more digestible and integratable Laban theory and Laban movement analysis, but also expound and extend on them in ways that made doing the work that I did not only feasible, but really a joy. Here's a picture of Dame Bartniff. Well, not Dame Bartniff. She lived in England. This has been a joy. This book I carry with me just about every day. I love this book. I love this book. If for no other reason than it's in the style and the perspective of the PBS of my early childhood. But on top of that, Bartniff has given me an entirely new aspect of the world with which to perceive, and a set of tools with which to perceive them. Not only in terms of the academic work that I'm doing, but also just in terms of the way that I experience the universe. And I'm very, very grateful to her. And when I meet dancers, or I'm talking to someone who turns out they're a dancer, the first thing I ask them is if they're familiar with Bartniff technique, fundamentals, and bond movement analysis. And then I talk to them about it. And very often they don't want to hear what I have to say, because I don't run into a lot of people really who know a lot about Bartniff fundamentals. But if I do, I'll know, because I'm going to ask them regardless, because she is amazing. And I am very, very grateful to her. This is almost 20 minutes, so I'm going to speed this up a bit. Okay. Tech, examples of tech books, we did that. Lomax. So, with the reality of colorimetrics, and with Bartniff's explanation of the world and movement and their integration, it gave me the platform to start asking the questions that I needed to ask, and then mold them into the right sort of perspectives on what might be a way to find the right answers. The first question is, what is affecting classical movement? What are the stressors and the morphers on classical training, specifically classical martial arts? But I do believe that the methodologies that I am working on developing will be very applicable to classical dance, which I'm very excited about. What are the things, specifically in modernity, but also through modernity, what have been the changes and movements over time that have changed things? Modernity is important here for one primary reason, because it's the present moment where we can see what is actually happening. And so we can actually look and see what is affecting those movements now, and what are the pressures and stresses on them. And if we can see what the pressures and stresses are on them now, we can make controls and be able to count for effects, but also we can extrapolate from that where these stresses were in the past. And in doing so, we can develop a very basic set of conjecture, which is what I've started to do this quarter, which will allow us to begin to test verifiably the actual half-life of motion, then develop things like sort of the continental shift equivocally. Now, the first thing that is really, really important in classical martial training, and in fighting in general, and in dancing, is rhythm. Now, generally speaking, when I explain to people classical martial arts, I tell them, if you can't dance, you probably can't fight. And if you can't fight, chances are you can't dance. The reason for this is fighting is playing off of rhythm, always, across the board, from time immemorial to the present day. It's the Zen concept of striking from nowhere, or using the spectra of Bartniff fundamentals and Wang movement analysis, the movement of movement from float to punch. Or, as Muhammad Ali likes to say, to float like a butterfly and to sting like a bee. What this is about is the fact that what you're working with is the perceptions and the perceptive matrix of an opponent. And so you always have to be on the offbeat. Consequently, you have to be a master of rhythm in order to fight effectively. This has a very important developmental factor in the affect and change of a given martial practice. Because if you want to know, for instance, what Northern Mantis style looked like circa 1550, you first have to know what sort of music was available to the practitioner in Beijing in 1650. What did the city sound like? What were the ox carts rolling along as? What did water passing off the eaves of houses give to the whole sense of tune? All of that implicitly and therefore very fundamentally and irrevocably changes the effect of the way someone will perform a martial practice. And seeing as how a martial practice, particularly in classical Chinese martial arts, is a set, it's a form. It's a form of classical dance in as much as all of the movements are set from beginning to end. And in their development, the real issue is in the application. So you can, for instance, if you're in a place, say here, and let's say the the order of constellation is thusly: grabbing, pulling, striking, and restriking. You can do that like this, but you can also do it like this. Or now, all of those tensions, rhythmically, are available to me because of the access that I have to the whole concepts of rhythm. For instance, there's an entire style of martial art, Bagua, which is a mid to late 19th century internal style, which has a particular variant in Harlem, referred to as Harlem style, which is fundamentally performatively different. Doing a set of control exercises on what practitioners and originators of Harlem style practice as and how they formulate their movement and what music they know really well, and then doing a control of more traditional classical Chinese practices, and then also of just general Western practitioners, but of classical Bagua, and seeing what music is available to them, and then being able to record what rhythms are in these different samplings and how they affect their training, will be, I think, one of the first basic controls for developing an actual theory out of a hypothetical conjecture that we will have. I'm very excited about that prospect. So, just as it's about almost a half an hour now, I'm going to go over a couple of other issues and then go on to what I intend to do next in this process. The first thing I want to talk about in these two sections is the issue of how film has affected martial training. Here are a set of broadswords. They are cold pressed non-stainless steel, and they are practice blades. They smell slightly of cedar due to their scabbard, and they have a blade that has a kind of a dead black burnt umber, roughly 11 inches across, where the saps of various nefarious brigand shrubberies were felled as practice cuts, obviously. But here's the issue. The blade wavers. Now it wavers because it's thin. This is actually a bludgeoning weapon. And you can, for not a lot of money, get a dao, which just means knife, because it's a single-edged curved blade. It's a saber, which is battle heavy, which would be roughly 3 times as thick and, along with the full hilt, probably 4 times as heavy. And the reason for that is because it's a bludgeoning weapon. And even though it has a sharp blade, it only has a sharp blade for about 10 inches. It has a medium sharp blade here, and then the rest of it is quite dull, because it's made for hitting someone repeatedly. You can also defend with it, and you can strike from a defensive position. It's the workhorse of the Chinese infantry. Now, the fact is that most Chinese theater troops, and particularly Beijing opera, does more movement than it does singing. There's almost no singing in Beijing opera. Cantonese opera is the one with all the singing. And a lot of, especially earlier, Wuxia period, which means swordsman, martial films had practice weapons, as opposed to more nicely made weapons. Now the thing about that is, when you strike with something like this, If you're striking forward, the tension is in your feet and in your ankles. And then also, because you're in horse stance, your knees. But as you go further up, it gets looser and looser. So if you're striking, it's something akin to. Now, as a consequence, the blade will waver because, first of all, it's not heavy and hard. And second of all, it's supposed to waver a little bit. It's a blade. Bronze weapons, which were very popular in the classical period, both in China and in Western Europe, prior to the Roman Empire, were not only malleable, but they were preferable to iron weapons because of the fact that if it was bent, you could unbend it in the middle of battle. And so we have historical records of men actually unbending their swords with their foot on the battlefield. Or you could also make a longer blade with a bronze blade than you could with an iron blade, and iron is brittle and heavier and more expensive. The issue is that seeing as how martial swordsmanship in classical China derives a direct lineage from bronze weaponry, and this weapon itself is not really meant to be extremely sturdy, it doesn't necessarily matter so much, unless you're using a type of recording device that is relatively new and synthetic. So what's happened is, instead of fighters and practitioners striking like that, they'll strike like this, or like this, where their upper body is tense and their lower body is loose, so that they have less connection to the ground, which means that their strikes are essentially worthless, and also the blade doesn't waver. Now, this has a profound effect implicitly on the practice of martial arts, because you would be hard-pressed to find a martial practitioner who has access to a telephone who has not seen a few martial arts movies. As a consequence, working on a control for this, which would involve basically watching sword movies from each decade going back to the 20s from Hong Kong, would allow us to sort of chart basically the development of the self-consciousness of these movements in a kind of a Heisenberg uncertainty principle way. And I think that from that will arise the ability to see exactly how people became self-conscious. And if we can start to observe the act of unself-conscious change and self-conscious change unself-consciously, we will be able to pinpoint markers on that change that we will then be able to use as carbon dating. So the next step in the process is twofold. One, develop more conjecture for possible tools and stresses whereupon we can develop a methodology. And two, to develop and begin exercising tests and assessments for the particular conjecture hypotheses that we now have. The two principal ones at the moment, the ones, I have a few, but the ones that are the most are the issue of rhythm and the issue of essentially martial vanity where film is concerned. And so people are literally playing to the camera because they are changing their movement and their muscle tensions to make it look better on camera in ways that they just wouldn't have even thought of prior to that, because there was no way to really perceive that type of motion and not to obsessively excruciate over it. You know, if you're an actor in a film, and I am an actor in films, as a matter of fact, this will be on a webpage full of films that I've been in you can watch what you do over and over and over and over again. And if what you didn't look dramatic and you were intending to be dramatic or you were being paid to be dramatic, well, by golly, you will be a little unhappy about it. And there's nothing actually inherently wrong with this type of change. But if we don't have a conscious set of observable metrics for it, then we have no way of accounting for it either. And that makes for a dangerous proposition because we don't have those now. And as a consequence, we don't really have an academic pedigree for classical martial arts. And furthermore, we don't have a way of developing with a reasonable amount of plausibility and with a knowledgeable amount of what the limitations of our plausibility is, what martial arts look like prior to the development of visual recording devices, and also what martial arts look like in places where we have no heritage pedigree. For instance, pre-Roman Europe. We have no idea, for instance, what the sword fighting techniques of Gaulish tribes were prior to Roman occupation. We can assume things, and if we had a set of tools with which to assess what forensic information we have articulately, then we would be able to assume more things, and I think that that is possible. So that is the ultimate goal and aim of the work, and the next step is to do more of that. Okay, I've already gone over a half hour, so I will go over one or two other things. One of them is the issue of constellations. Now, in classical dance, movements are taught in constellations. And this is also true in classical martial arts. So, for instance, and this is simply for the sake of explanation because I'm sure you are aware, Professor, when doing ballet, people plie, they're taught where their arms go and how their knees move. And I probably didn't do that very well because it's been about nearly 30 years since I was plieing. And the same thing also in other classical forms of dance. If you're doing Balinese Lagong, the way that you move is all performed in unison. This is true in martial arts as well. For instance, a ready position is here. Now, the development of this constellation is particular because it's actually working on keeping a steady line, but also a very specific set of utilitarian principles. Now, there is a window of complexity in constellations whereupon not advanced enough, and it's useless. Because if I, for instance, tell people to punch, and I don't give them any sense of where their muscles are, and also where their legs should be, it's not going to make any sense to them. Even if they say that they understand, they think that they understand, they'll have no way of recording it, and it certainly will not continue. And so there is a threshold of complexity, there's a minimum, but then there's also a maximum as well, whereupon if you give people too many things to do at once, it's going to fall apart and no one's ever going to remember anything. But the issues of constellations are that they retain data loss, so they work against data degradation over an extended period of time. Studying that and working out a control for what that threshold is exactly and how much change happens is actually, I think, very plausible in terms of a developmental methodological, a developmental method. It's really late. It's really late. I'm stuttering. I apologize. It's 2:30 in the morning. I spent all weekend trying to upload this, and it didn't work. all 6 times. And so now I'm in the middle of the night on Monday doing another one. I apologize. It is a plausible issue that we might be able to develop a set of specific limitations, both minimums and maximums, on what constellations are useful, and also within that, gradations of how long they retain data and how the data changes and shifts. Sort of a carbon dating half-life, if you will. And then on top of that, also developing through all of these, working out a gestalt issue of what the actual limitations of peering to the past are, much like looking to the floor of a pond. That's also, the limits of the radar, so to speak. That's also really plausible. I don't know if I've left anything out. Practice, research, tests. But I look forward to hearing from you, Professor. Thank you for listening for, it's now over 40 minutes. And I'm going to upload this, and I look forward to hearing back from you. And if you feel free, if you wish, feel free to look at the other videos on my page. Some of them are films I did for school, and some of them are just films that I did. So thank you for being patient, and I hope to talk to you soon. Good evening.